What if I told you that America once didn't know who its president was for 36 days? And the answer came down to tiny pieces of paper called hanging chads, or that a candidate was shot in the chest mid campaign and finished his 90-minute speech while bleeding and still lost, or that the biggest newspaper in Chicago printed 2 million copies declaring the wrong winner. American presidential elections aren't just about policies and debates. They're about mudslinging so vicious it killed a candidate's wife, billionaires buying TV time to show charts, a basement campaign conducted over Zoom during a plague, and friendships between founding fathers that exploded into warfare. Before we dive in, if you love stories where history gets messy, chaotic, and deeply human, hit that subscribe button. You'll want to come back for more. Now, let's start in 1800, when two friends became enemies, and America learned whether democracy could survive its own passion. 1800, Adams versus Jefferson, the election that broke friendship. In the spring of 1776, two men stood side by side in Philadelphia, drafting the words that would birth a nation. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were not merely colleagues. They were brothers in revolution, bound by shared sacrifice and common vision. 24 years later, they became bitter enemies. The election of 1800 was unlike anything America had witnessed. The young republic's constitution contained a fatal flaw. Presidential candidates didn't run with vice presidential running mates. Instead, each elector cast 2 votes, and whoever came second became vice president. This meant that in 1796, Jefferson, Adams's political opponent, had become his vice president. 4 years of tension followed. By 1800, the nation had fractured into 2 camps. Adams led the Federalists, who championed strong central government, ties with Britain, and the moneyed commercial class. Jefferson commanded the Democratic Republicans, advocating states' rights, sympathy toward France, and the interests of farmers and common men. What had begun as policy disagreements metastasized into personal venom. The campaign turned vicious. Federalist newspapers painted Jefferson as a godless radical who would import French guillotines to American streets. They claimed his presidency would unleash mob rule and destroy Christianity itself. One pamphlet warned that Jefferson would confiscate Bibles and force women into immoral servitude. Republican papers fired back, depicting Adams as a wannabe monarch plotting to marry his son to King George's daughter and reunite America with Britain. Neither candidate campaigned directly. Such behavior was considered undignified, but their surrogates showed no such restraint. Alexander Hamilton, though a Federalist, despised Adams so thoroughly that he circulated a 54-page letter attacking the president's character. The document leaked, damaging Adams fatally. When electoral votes were tallied, Adams had lost. But Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, had tied at 73 votes each. The Constitution mandated that a tie be broken by the House of Representatives, with each state delegation casting 1 vote. The Federalists still controlled the lame duck House, and many preferred even Burr, a man of no fixed principles, to Jefferson. 35 ballots came and went over 6 frozen February days in 1801. Jefferson remained 1 state short of victory. Behind closed doors, Hamilton lobbied furiously. He loathed Jefferson, but he understood him. Burr, Hamilton warned, was bankrupt beyond redemption in character. Better a predictable opponent than an unprincipled opportune. On the 36th ballot, several Federalists abstained. Delaware and South Carolina flipped. Jefferson won. Adams refused to attend Jefferson's inauguration. He departed Washington at 4 a.m. on March 4th, 1801, his bitterness complete. Yet Jefferson's inaugural address struck a conciliatory note that would echo through centuries. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. He insisted that political disagreement need not mean personal enmity, that a functioning democracy required accepting defeat with grace. It was the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing parties in modern history. No soldiers surrounded the capital. No blood ran in the streets. The revolution of 1800 happened with ballots, not bullets. Adams and Jefferson would not speak for 12 years. Eventually, mutual friends brokered a reconciliation through letters. They wrote to each other until both died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after independence. The election that broke their friendship also proved something remarkable, that democracy, messy and painful as it might be, could survive its own passion. 1824, the corrupt bargain. No one won the election of 1824. That single sentence captures both the confusion and the controversy that would reshape American politics forever. 4 men sought the presidency that year. Andrew Jackson, the military hero who slaughtered the British at New Orleans. John Quincy Adams, son of the second president and current Secretary of State. William Crawford, Treasury Secretary and darling of traditional Democratic Republicans. And Henry Clay, the charismatic Speaker of the House known as the Great Compromiser. The problem was simple. All 4 belonged to the same political party. The Federalists had collapsed after the War of 1812, leaving the Democratic Republicans without opposition, but internal factions splintered what remained. The era of good feelings, as historians labeled it, felt anything but good to those competing for power. Jackson won the popular vote decisively, 41% to Adams's 31%. He also captured 99 electoral votes to Adams's 84. But the Constitution required a majority of electoral votes, 131, and no one reached it. For the second time in American history, the House would choose the president. The 12th Amendment, ratified after the Jefferson-Burr debacle, limited the House to selecting among the top 3 candidates. This eliminated Clay, who'd finished 4th. It also gave him extraordinary power. As Speaker, Clay controlled which way many House delegations would vote. He made no secret of his disdain for Jackson, calling him a military chieftain, unfit for civilian leadership. Jackson, Clay believed, had the temperament of a dictator. Crawford had recently suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and nearly blind, hardly presidential material. That left Adams. Clay and Adams met privately. The details of their conversation remain disputed, lost to history and competing narratives. What followed was not. Clay threw his support to Adams, and on February 9th, 1825, the House elected Adams on the first ballot. 13 states voted for Adams, 7 for Jackson, 4 for Crawford. 3 days later, Adams announced his cabinet. Henry Clay would be Secretary of State. Jackson exploded. The Secretary of State position was understood as the stepping stone to the presidency. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and now Adams himself had all followed that path. To Jackson and his supporters, the sequence was damning. Clay had sold his influence for the promise of future power. "Corrupt bargain," Jackson's supporters roared. "The will of the people has been defeated by the intrigues of aristocrats in smoke-filled rooms." Newspapers sympathetic to Jackson turned venomous. The general himself, usually prone to violent outbursts, played the wounded statesman. He resigned his Senate seat and began campaigning immediately for 1828. Adams's presidency never recovered. Every initiative faced obstruction. His proposals for national infrastructure, a naval academy, and astronomical observatories, all defeated by a Congress aligned with Jackson. Adams called for federal funding of scientific research and exploration. His opponents mocked him as an out-of-touch elitist. The corrupt bargain charge stuck like tar. Clay insisted until his death that no deal had been made, that he had simply chosen the candidate he believed most qualified. Adams maintained identical innocence. Historians remained divided, but the perception mattered more than the truth. The election of 1824 shattered the one-party system and birthed genuine two-party democracy. Jackson's supporters coalesced into the Democratic Party, while Adams's allies formed the National Republicans, precursor to the Whigs. American politics had been transformed. No longer would gentlemen compete politely for office. Now campaigns would be wars, fought with newspapers, rallies, and accusations. The corrupt bargain had taught a generation that righteousness mattered less than organization. Jackson would remember. 4 years later, he'd be ready. 1828. Mud, marriage, and murder rumors. Andrew Jackson married a bigamist, or so his opponents claimed during the ugliest presidential campaign in American history. The charge had kernels of truth twisted into weapons. Rachel Donaldson Robards had been married before she met Jackson. Her first husband, Lewis Robards, was violently jealous and abusive. When Rachel fled Kentucky for Tennessee in 1790, Jackson was part of her escort. They fell in love. Word came that Robards had obtained a divorce through the Virginia legislature. Jackson and Rachel married in 1791 in Natchez, believing themselves free and lawful. But Robards had only secured permission to file for divorce, not the divorce itself. The actual decree came in 1793. Technically, Rachel had been married to two men simultaneously. Jackson and Rachel remarried immediately upon discovering the error. For 37 years, they lived as devoted partners. Rachel was stout, matronly, and deeply religious, the opposite of Washington society. She smoked a cornpipe and had no interest in political life. Jackson adored her completely. In 1828, Adams's supporters weaponized the marriage. Pamphlets flooded the country calling Rachel an adulteress and Jackson a wife-stealer. One Cincinnati newspaper proclaimed, "Ought a convicted adulteress and her paramour husband be placed in the highest offices?" Another suggested Jackson's mother had been a prostitute who married a mulatto man, calling Jackson's legitimacy and racial purity into question. Jackson's camp responded with equal venom. They resurrected old accusations that Adams, while serving as minister to Russia, had procured a young American woman for Tsar Alexander. The charge was absurd. Adams had introduced a female acquaintance at court, but truth mattered less than damage. They called Adams an elitist aristocrat who'd installed gambling furniture in the White House. The gambling furniture was a billiards table Adams had purchased with his own money. The campaign resembled a street brawl more than a civic exercise. Jackson's supporters wore hickory leaves and carried hickory sticks. Old Hickory was his nickname. They organized barbecues, parades, and rallies that looked like religious revivals. Common men could attend and chant Jackson's name like a mantra. Jackson himself maintained strategic silence on issues, letting his biography speak. Orphaned at 14, self-made lawyer, Indian fighter, hero of New Orleans, he embodied the frontier spirit, the notion that any man, not just Virginia gentry, could lead. His opponents called this dangerous populism. His supporters called it democracy. The personal attacks devastated Rachel. She'd long been content on their Tennessee plantation, the Hermitage, away from scrutiny. Now her most painful memory became public entertainment. She wept over newspaper articles. Friends reported her saying she'd rather die than go to Washington. Jackson won in a landslide. 178 electoral votes to Adams's 83. He captured 56% of the popular vote. The people had spoken decisively. But 3 weeks after the election, before Jackson's December departure for Washington, Rachel collapsed. She died on December 22, 1828. Jackson was inconsolable. He blamed his political enemies for literally murdering his wife through slander. At her funeral, Jackson spoke briefly. "In the presence of this dear saint, I can and do forgive all my enemies. But those vile wretches who have slandered her must look to God for mercy." When Jackson took the oath of office on March 4, 1829, he wore a black armband. His inaugural party descended into chaos as thousands of admirers mobbed the White House, breaking china and standing on furniture. Jackson himself fled through a window. The age of Jackson had begun, born in triumph and tragedy, proof that democracy's victories carry unforeseen costs. 1840, log cabins and hard cider. William Henry Harrison never lived in a log cabin. He was born to Virginia aristocracy, educated at Hampton-Sydney College, and resided in a 16-room mansion in Ohio. Yet the log cabin became his symbol, the image that won him the presidency. Sometimes lies work better than truth. By 1840, Martin Van Buren had presided over economic catastrophe. The Panic of 1837 had triggered bank failures, unemployment, and widespread suffering. Van Buren, a New York sophisticate who favored silk vests, seemed indifferent to common struggles. His political opponents smelled blood. The Whig Party, formed from the remnants of Adams supporters and others united mainly by their hatred of Jackson, needed a candidate who could compete with Democratic populism. They needed someone who wasn't Henry Clay, whose 3 previous presidential bids had failed. They settled on Harrison, a 67-year-old former general whose main qualification was winning the Battle of Tippecanoe against Tecumseh's Confederation nearly 30 years prior. Harrison wasn't particularly charismatic. He wasn't particularly anything, which made him the perfect blank slate. One Democratic newspaper, attempting mockery, wrote that Harrison would be content with a barrel of hard cider and a pension of $2,000 a year if given a log cabin instead of the presidency. The Whigs recognized genius when they saw it. They transformed the insult into branding. Suddenly, log cabins appeared everywhere, on buttons, banners, flags, and enormous parade floats. Whigs distributed hard cider at rallies, thousands of gallons, given freely to crowds. They built actual log cabin campaign headquarters in cities across America where men could gather, drink cider, and celebrate frontier values that Harrison didn't actually embody. Tippecanoe and Tyler too became the campaign slogan, pairing Harrison with his vice presidential candidate, John Tyler, in a rhythmic chant that required zero policy understanding. They sang it at massive rallies that resembled revival meetings. One Pennsylvania parade stretched 3 miles long. The Whigs sold Harrison as the log cabin and hard cider candidate, while painting Van Buren as an effete snob who ate French food with gold spoons. Never mind that Harrison came from wealth or that Van Buren's father had been a tavern keeper. Perception trumped reality. Harrison barely spoke during the campaign. His handlers, terrified he'd say something damaging, kept him mostly silent. When he did appear, he stuck to vague platitudes about restoring prosperity and respecting the common man. It worked perfectly. The Whigs also innovated campaign tactics that became standard. Mass-produced memorabilia, coordinated talking points, organized rallies in every state, and the first campaign newspaper created specifically for a presidential race. They understood something fundamental. Elections were becoming entertainment, and entertainment required production values. Van Buren's campaign tried fighting with policy papers and earnest arguments about economic theory. They may as well have been whispering in a hurricane. The Whigs drowned them out with spectacle. Harrison won decisively, 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60. Voter turnout reached 80%, unprecedented. The log cabin strategy had mobilized Americans who'd never cared about politics before. On March 4th, 1841, Harrison delivered his inaugural address in cold rain without coat or hat. He wanted to demonstrate his vigor despite his age. The speech lasted 1 hour and 45 minutes, 8,445 words, the longest inaugural address in American history. Harrison caught pneumonia. 31 days later, he died, the first president to die in office. John Tyler, Tyler II, assumed the presidency, shocking everyone who thought vice presidents were ceremonial positions. The log cabin campaign had worked too well. It had sold Americans an image, a feeling, a brand. Harrison's actual person had become irrelevant. He was packaging, not product, the first modern candidate. The lesson stuck. In American politics, the story you tell matters more than the truth you live. 1860, Lincoln and A Nation in Pieces. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without appearing on ballots in 10 states. He received 0 popular votes across the entire South. His name itself was a provocation, a declaration of disunion. The election of 1860 didn't cause the Civil War. Decades of compromise, crisis, and contradiction had built that powder keg. But Lincoln's victory lit the match. 4 candidates divided America by geography. Lincoln represented the new Republican Party, founded just 6 years earlier on one principle: no expansion of slavery into Western territories. Republicans didn't demand immediate abolition in states where slavery existed, but they insisted the institution must not spread. To Southern planners, this was existential threat disguised as moderation. Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, championed popular sovereignty. Let each territory vote on slavery for itself. He'd authored the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which had turned Kansas into a battlefield between pro-slavery and free soil settlers. His position satisfied nobody fully, but offended everybody partially. Southern Democrats, having stormed out of their own party convention, nominated Vice President John Breckinridge. Their platform demanded federal protection of slavery everywhere, including territories. They viewed Northern reluctance to defend slavery as betrayal. The Constitutional Union Party, desperately centrist, willfully ignorant of reality, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Their entire platform consisted of supporting the Constitution and avoiding sectional conflict. They offered nostalgia for an already dead past. Lincoln conducted no traditional campaign. He gave no speeches after his nomination, believing the presidency required dignity. Surrogates spoke for him while he remained in Springfield, Illinois, receiving visitors and writing careful letters. His silence was strategic. Every word would be dissected, weaponized, twisted. Southern newspapers didn't need his words. They created their own Lincoln, the Black Republican who would free slaves, encourage racial mixing, and destroy white civilization. Pamphlets depicted him as a tyrant in waiting. Fire eaters, Southern radicals, declared that Lincoln's election would justify secession. Douglas broke precedent by campaigning actively, traveling 18,000 miles and giving hundreds of speeches. In the South, he warned that Lincoln's election would destroy the Union. In the North, he argued that popular sovereignty represented the only compromise that could preserve peace. He was partly right and entirely doomed. Election day was November 6th. Results trickled in via telegraph, that modern miracle that delivered news at lightning speed. Lincoln swept the North 18 states, 180 electoral votes. He won 54% of Northern votes, but only 40% nationally. Douglas won Missouri and 3 of 7 New Jersey electors, a humiliating stunt place that left him devastated. Breckinridge carried 11 Southern states. Bell took Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The map told a story of fracture. America had voted as 4 separate countries. South Carolina's legislature convened immediately. On December 20th, 1860, they voted unanimously for secession. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed within 6 weeks. They seized federal forts, arsenals, and mints. Lincoln remained in Springfield, powerless until inauguration. President James Buchanan, a lame duck, insisted he had no constitutional authority to stop secession, but that secession was also illegal, a logical pretzel that satisfied no one. The Union dissolved while its leaders watched helplessly. In February 1861, delegates from seceded states met in Montgomery. Alabama, and formed the Confederate States of America. They elected Jefferson Davis president. Two nations now claimed American soil. Lincoln traveled to Washington by train, rerouting through Baltimore at night after detectives uncovered an assassination plot. He arrived disguised, inaugurated under military protection, and delivered an address both conciliatory and firm. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. 5 weeks later, Confederate artillery bombarded Fort Sumter. Lincoln had won an election. The nation had lost itself. Democracy had revealed its darkest truth. Sometimes majorities and minorities cannot coexist peacefully, and ballots become preludes to bullets. 1876, Hayes versus Tilden and the Compromise of 1877. Samuel Tilden won the election of 1876. Everybody knew it. The popular vote wasn't close. 4,289,000 votes for Tilden, 4,036,000 for Rutherford Hayes. Tilden needed one more electoral vote for victory. He never got it. What happened instead became the most corrupt bargain in American history, a backroom deal that traded the presidency for the soul of Reconstruction, abandoning 4 million freedmen to nearly a century of terror. The election occurred during America's centennial, with the Republic still scarred by civil war and struggling with Reconstruction. Federal troops remained stationed across the South, protecting black voters and enforcing civil rights. Southern whites called this occupation. Black Americans called it survival. Tilden, a New York Democrat and reform governor, promised to end Reconstruction and restore home rule to Southern states. Hayes, an Ohio Republican and former Union general, supported continuing federal protection for black citizens. The difference was profound. Election night seemed clear. Tilden captured New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Indiana, and the entire South except for 3 states still under Republican governments: South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. If those results stood, Tilden won 184 electoral votes to Hayes's 165. But Republican officials in those 3 states controlled the vote-counting machinery. They threw out thousands of ballots, claiming intimidation and fraud. They weren't entirely wrong. White supremacist groups had terrorized black voters, murdered Republican officials, and stuffed ballot boxes. But Republicans also manipulated counts for partisan advantage. Competing slates of electors emerged from all 3 states, each claiming legitimacy. 20 electoral votes hung in limbo. Both candidates needed them to reach 185, the majority required. The Constitution provided no mechanism for resolving disputed electoral votes. Congress was split. Democrats controlled the House. Republicans controlled the Senate. Deadlock loomed. Some feared another civil war. In late January 1877, Congress created an electoral commission. 15 members, 8 Republicans, and 7 Democrats. Everyone understood the fix was in, but the commission alone couldn't resolve the crisis. Democrats controlled the House and could theoretically refuse to certify any result. Southern Democratic congressmen held the key. Secret negotiations began at Wormley's Hotel in Washington. Republican operatives met with Southern Democrats. The deal crystallized. Southern Democrats would accept Hayes's presidency. Republicans would withdraw federal troops from the South, ending Reconstruction. Additional promises sweetened the arrangement: federal funding for Southern railroads and internal improvements, appointment of a Southerner to Hayes's cabinet, non-interference in Southern domestic affairs, code for letting whites re-establish supremacy. The Electoral Commission voted strictly along party lines, 8-7, awarding all 20 disputed votes to Hayes. On March 2, 1877, 2 days before inauguration, Congress certified the result. Hayes 185, Tilden 184. Tilden accepted defeat. I can retire to private life with the consciousness that I shall receive from posterity the credit of having been elected to the highest position in the gift of the people, without any of the cares and responsibilities of the office, he said. History would remember him as the man who won but lost. Hayes took office under a cloud. Democrats called him his fraudulency and Rutherford Hayes. He'd promised during the campaign to serve only one term. He kept that promise, perhaps from shame. In April 1877, Hayes withdrew federal troops from South Carolina and Louisiana. Reconstruction governments collapsed immediately. White supremacist Redeemer governments seized power. Within months, black political participation plummeted. Within years, Jim Crow laws formalized segregation. Within decades, lynching became routine. The Compromise of 1877 saved the Union from immediate crisis by sacrificing justice. Democracy had revealed another dark truth. Political stability sometimes requires moral catastrophe. 4 million freedmen learned that citizenship means nothing without power to defend it. That lesson would echo for generations. 1888. Cleveland wins votes, loses office. Grover Cleveland received 100,000 more popular votes than Benjamin Harrison. The American people preferred Cleveland. They just didn't get him. The election of 1888 proved that sometimes democracy works exactly as designed, and the design seems absurd. Cleveland, seeking re-election after his first term, ran on a platform that baffled his own party: tariff reduction. Tariffs, taxes on imported goods, protected American manufacturers from foreign competition, but raised prices for consumers. Cleveland believed they'd become excessive, enriching robber barons while punishing farmers and workers. His opponents called this economic treason. Republicans insisted that high tariffs protected American jobs and prosperity. Protection became their rallying cry. Never mind that tariffs functioned as taxes on ordinary Americans, the rhetoric worked. Benjamin Harrison, grandson of President William Henry Harrison, became the Republican nominee. He was competent, forgettable, and beholden to party bosses. He campaigned from his Indianapolis home, giving carefully scripted speeches to visiting delegations. Journalists called it his front porch campaign. The real action happened elsewhere. Republican operatives, led by James G. Blaine and Matthew Quay, raised unprecedented sums from manufacturers terrified of tariff reduction. Steel magnates, textile owners, and industrialists poured money into Republican coffers. They bought influence systematically. In New York and Indiana, crucial swing states, both parties deployed what we'd now call voter suppression and election fraud. Republicans hired floaters, men who'd vote multiple times under different names. Democrats did the same. Both sides paid for votes outright, $5 to $20 per ballot. Tammany Hall, New York's Democratic machine, mobilized immigrants with promises and threats. Republican machines countered with equal ruthlessness. Cleveland won the popular vote, 5,537,000 to Harrison's 5,447,000. He captured the South, Connecticut, New Jersey, and, most painful of his losses, his home state of New York, though by only 14,000 votes out of 1,200,000 cast. But Harrison won the Electoral College, 233 to 168. New York's 36 electoral votes made the difference. If Cleveland had carried New York, his home state where he'd been governor, he'd have won re-election comfortably. Republicans crowed about their victory. Harrison himself seemed ambivalent, reportedly saying, "Providence has given us the victory." Matthew Quay, the Republican boss who'd organized the money and muscle, supposedly replied, "Think of the man. He ought to know that Providence hadn't a damn thing to do with it." Cleveland accepted defeat with characteristic stubbornness. As he left the White House, his wife Frances told staff, "Take good care of the furniture. We'll be back." She was right. Harrison's presidency proved underwhelming. He passed the McKinley tariff, raising rates even higher, which triggered economic backlash. He signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, but rarely enforced it. His administration looked like what it was: the product of machine politics and corporate money. In 1892, Cleveland and Harrison faced each other again. This time, Cleveland won both popular vote and electoral college, becoming the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. He returned to Washington, vindicated. The election of 1888 revealed the Electoral College's peculiar mathematics. A system designed to balance large and small states now balanced nothing but historical accident. Swing states gained disproportionate power. Candidates ignored safe states and focused obsessively on a handful of battlegrounds. Democracy had become a math problem, one where winning required not the most votes, but the right votes in the right places. Cleveland learned this lesson twice. Once through bitter defeat, once through sweet revenge. The system worked perfectly, which made it seem all the more broken. 1896, Cross of Gold, William Jennings. Bryan spoke for less than 40 minutes. His words rewrote American politics forever. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago, July 1896, faced a crisis of identity. The Panic of 1893 had plunged America into depression. Banks failed. Railroads collapsed. Unemployment soared. Farmers lost everything as agricultural prices cratered. Two economic philosophies battled for the party's soul. Gold standard advocates insisted that American currency must be backed exclusively by gold reserves. This made money scarce, credit tight, and deflation brutal for debtors, mainly farmers who'd borrowed for land and equipment. Silver advocates demanded free silver, unlimited coinage of silver at a ratio of 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. This would inflate the currency, ease debt burdens, and transfer wealth from creditors to debtors. The gold versus silver debate wasn't really about monetary policy. It was about power. Eastern bankers versus Western farmers, established wealth versus struggling labor, tradition versus populism. Bryan, a 36-year-old former congressman from Nebraska, had been campaigning for silver for 2 years. He'd given the same basic speech hundreds of times across the Midwest, refining it, sharpening it, loading every phrase with emotional dynamite. On July 9th, the convention's final day, Bryan took the stage. He spoke without notes, his voice carrying to 15,000 delegates in the sweltering hall. He began quietly, building slowly, then escalated to thunder. He spoke for workers. The man who is employed for wages is as much a businessman as his employer. He spoke for the farmers. The man who goes forth in the morning and toils all day is as much a businessman as the man who goes upon the board of trade and bets upon the price of grain. Then came the crescendo. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. He placed his hands to his head, mimicking a crown. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. He extended his arms like Christ on the cross. Silence, then pandemonium. Delegates erupted. They screamed, wept, carried Bryan on their shoulders. The convention nominated him for president by acclamation. At 36, he became the youngest presidential nominee in American history. The Republicans had nominated William McKinley, a congressman from Ohio and architect of high tariffs. McKinley represented stability, prosperity, and the gold standard. His campaign manager, Mark Hanna, was a Cleveland industrialist who understood modern politics required modern money. Hanna raised approximately $3,500,000, astronomical for the time, from corporations terrified of free silver. He produced millions of pamphlets, coordinated thousands of speakers, and saturated newspapers with pro-McKinley content. He invented the modern campaign. McKinley never left his home in Canton, Ohio. Instead, he gave short speeches from his front porch to delegations brought by railroad. The railroads provided free transportation. Hanna paid for everything else. Hundreds of thousands visited Canton that summer and fall. Bryan campaigned like a man possessed. He traveled 18,000 miles by train, gave 600 speeches in 29 states, and spoke directly to 5 million Americans. He was the first candidate to truly campaign personally for the presidency, and his energy was supernatural. But energy couldn't compete with money. Hanna's operation reached every corner of America. Employers threatened to close factories if Bryan won. Banks warned of financial apocalypse. Newspapers, most controlled by wealthy owners, depicted Bryan as dangerous, radical, anarchist. McKinley won, 271 electoral votes to Bryan's 176. He captured the Northeast, the Midwest, and California. Bryan swept the South and the West. The popular vote was closer than the electoral count suggested: 7,112,000 for McKinley, 6,509,000 for Bryan. The election marked a turning point. Bryan proved that personality and oratory could mobilize millions. But McKinley and Hanna proved that organization, money, and media control could beat charisma. Modern campaigning required both: passion to inspire and infrastructure to deliver. Bryan would run twice more and lose both times, but his cross of gold speech lived on, studied by every subsequent politician who understood that emotion, delivered with precision, could move nations. 1912. Roosevelt splits the Republicans. Theodore Roosevelt destroyed his own party to satisfy his ego. At least that's how his enemies told it. Roosevelt would say he destroyed his party to save the country. Both versions were true. In 1912, William Howard Taft sought re-election. 4 years earlier, Roosevelt, having served nearly 2 terms after McKinley's assassination, had handpicked Taft as his successor. Roosevelt believed Taft would continue progressive reforms: trust-busting, conservation, labor rights. Then Roosevelt left for a year-long African safari and European tour, confident his legacy was secure. He returned to find Taft dismantling it. Taft had actually prosecuted more trusts than Roosevelt, but he had done so cautiously, alienating progressives without satisfying conservatives. He'd fired Gifford Pinchot, Roosevelt's close friend and chief forester, triggering conservationist fury. Taft governed as a conservative jurist, not a progressive crusader. Roosevelt seethed. He watched Taft align with old guard Republicans, the very men Roosevelt had battled for years. By late 1911, Roosevelt decided he wanted his job back. "My hat is in the ring," he declared in February 1912. The phrase entered American lexicon instantly. The Republican primaries, still a new innovation, favored Roosevelt. He won 9 of 12 states that held them, including Taft's home state of Ohio. But most convention delegates were selected by state party bosses, and bosses backed Taft. The president controlled party machinery. Roosevelt had only popularity. At the Republican convention in June, credentials battles erupted. Roosevelt's delegates claimed fraud. Taft's delegates claimed legitimacy. The party chairman, a Taft loyalist, ruled consistently for Taft. Roosevelt's supporters walked out, accusing theft. Taft won renomination. Roosevelt, furious and vindictive, formed a third party. The Progressive Party, instantly nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, after Roosevelt declared he felt as strong as a bull moose, held its own convention in August. Delegates sang "Onward, Christian Soldiers" and displayed religious fervor. Roosevelt delivered a confession of faith. "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." His platform was genuinely progressive. Women's suffrage, labor protections, social insurance, direct election of senators, and prohibition of child labor. It represented everything Republicans were supposed to support, and Taft had abandoned. Meanwhile, Democrats nominated Woodrow Wilson, a former political science professor and current New Jersey governor. Wilson had reformed New Jersey politics and championed his own progressivism, which he called the New Freedom. Unlike Roosevelt's New Nationalism, which accepted big business regulated by big government, Wilson wanted to break up monopolies and restore competition. The campaign became a three-way ideological debate, the most substantive in American history. Roosevelt barnstormed with characteristic energy. In Milwaukee, a saloon keeper shot him in the chest. The bullet lodged in his chest muscle, slowed by his steel eyeglass case and 50-page speech manuscript. Roosevelt insisted on delivering the speech anyway, speaking for 90 minutes while bleeding. "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot," he began, "but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Taft, humiliated and exhausted, barely campaigned. He knew he'd lose. "I might as well give up as far as being a candidate," he told friends. "There are so many people in the country who don't like me." Wilson won easily, 435 electoral votes to Roosevelt's 88 and Taft's 8. The popular vote told a different story. Wilson received 42%, Roosevelt 37, Taft 23. A majority of Americans voted for progressive candidates. The Republican split had handed Democrats total victory. Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party dissolved within 4 years. Roosevelt himself never held office again. He died in 1919, bitter about Wilson's presidency and America's delayed entry into World War I. But the election proved something fundamental. In American politics, personality can destroy institutions faster than ideology. The Republican Party, which had dominated national politics for 16 years, fractured because one man's ego couldn't accept retirement. Democracy requires parties to survive their leaders. In 1912, Republicans failed that test spectacularly. 1920, the radio election, Warren Harding won the presidency by looking presidential. That was essentially the entire strategy, and it worked perfectly. The election of 1920 occurred in the shadow of catastrophe. World War I had ended just 2 years earlier, leaving Europe destroyed and America exhausted. The Treaty of Versailles and League of Nations divided the country between Woodrow Wilson's internationalists and isolationists who wanted nothing more to do with European entanglements. The 18th Amendment had enacted prohibition. The 19th Amendment had given women the vote, doubling the electorate overnight. Spanish flu had killed 675,000 Americans. Race riots had exploded across the country during the Red Summer of 1919. Americans were tired of war, of reform, of crisis, of Wilson's self-righteous moralizing. They wanted normal. Harding, an Ohio senator who looked like a president from central casting, promised exactly that. "America's present need is not heroics, but healing," he declared in a May speech. "Not nostrums, but normalcy. Not revolution, but restoration. Not surgery, but serenity." Normalcy became his campaign theme. The word didn't really exist. Grammarians insisted the correct term was normality, but Harding made it sound soothing. He ran a front porch campaign reminiscent of McKinley, receiving delegations at his Marion, Ohio home. He gave brief, vague speeches that said almost nothing. He stood on his porch, smiled, shook hands, and embodied stability. His campaign manager, Harry Daugherty, orchestrated everything, keeping Harding away from journalists who might ask difficult questions. The Republicans attacked Wilson's League of Nations as a surrender of American sovereignty. They blamed Democrats for post-war recession and inflation. They promised lower taxes, higher tariffs, and an end to government interference in business. Their platform could be summarized: return to the America that existed before Wilson tried to save the world. Democrats nominated Ohio Governor James Cox, who'd actually accomplished progressive reforms. His running mate was Assistant Navy Secretary Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Hoping the Roosevelt name carried magic, Cox campaigned energetically, defending the League and Wilson's record. He gave hundreds of speeches and traveled thousands of miles. He may as well have whispered into a hurricane. The election coincided with America's first commercial radio broadcasts. On November 2nd, 1920, KDKA in Pittsburgh broadcast election returns, the first commercial radio program in history. A few thousand listeners heard results as they arrived via telegraph, then were announced by station staff. Most Americans still learned results through newspapers, but radio represented the future. Politics was becoming performance, and performance needed media. Harding, with his deep voice and handsome appearance, was built for this new age. Cox, energetic but ordinary, was not. Women voted for the first time nationally. Nobody knew how this would affect outcomes. Conventional wisdom assumed women would vote for peace and morality. Some predicted they'd support the League and back Democrats. Others thought women would vote as their husbands directed. Election day revealed a repudiation unprecedented in American history. Harding won 60% of the popular vote, 16,144,000 votes to Cox's 9,140,000. He captured 404 electoral votes. Cox won just 127. Harding swept the Northeast, the Midwest, the West, and even several border states. Cox held only the South. The margin was devastating. Women hadn't saved the League or voted as a bloc. They'd voted as individuals, and most wanted normalcy too. Harding's victory represented exhaustion triumphing over idealism. Americans had spent 2 decades in progressive reform and war. They wanted rest. They wanted a government that left them alone. They wanted a president who didn't demand they become better versions of themselves. Harding gave them exactly that, until his administration collapsed into the most corrupt in American history to that point. Teapot Dome, kickbacks, bribes, and scandals. Harding died in office in 1923, possibly of a heart attack, possibly by poisoning, leaving historians to debate which of his affairs or corruptions killed him. But in 1920, none of that mattered. Americans heard what they wanted to hear, sometimes through the crackling miracle of radio. They saw what they wanted to see, a handsome man who promised nothing would change. Democracy had chosen comfort over challenge. Within a decade, the bill would come due. 1932, FDR and the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover never had a chance. By 1932, America was drowning, and voters blamed the man at the helm. The Great Depression had begun with the stock market crash of October 1929. Banks failed by the thousands. Unemployment reached 25%. 13 million people without work. Farmers lost their land. Families lost their homes. Breadlines stretched around city blocks. Hoovervilles, shantytowns named mockingly after the president, sprouted in parks and vacant lots. Hoover insisted the economy would heal itself. He opposed direct federal relief, believing it would destroy American character and self-reliance. He spoke in statistics and reassurances that rang hollow to men selling apples on street corners. Prosperity is just around the corner, his administration repeated. The corner never came. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, New York's governor and a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, offered something Hoover couldn't: hope wrapped in confidence. FDR had contracted polio in 1921, leaving his legs paralyzed. He'd fought back, teaching himself to stand with leg braces and walk short distances supported by canes or someone's arm. The press cooperated in never photographing his wheelchair or his weakness. Americans saw a vigorous man who'd overcome personal catastrophe. Roosevelt's campaign promised a New Deal for the American people, though he never precisely defined what that meant. He spoke in broad strokes: relief for the suffering, recovery for the economy, reform to prevent future crashes. Specifics could wait. More importantly, he sounded confident. His voice, resonant, patrician, utterly assured, conveyed that someone knew what to do, even if that someone wouldn't quite say it yet. He smiled constantly. His cigarette holder jutted at a jaunty angle. He radiated optimism when Americans were drowning in despair. Roosevelt broke tradition by flying to the Democratic Convention in Chicago to accept the nomination in person, the first candidate ever to do so. "I pledge you, I pledge myself, to a new deal for the American people," he declared. The phrase stuck instantly. He campaigned energetically, traveling 13,000 miles and giving 16 major speeches. Unlike Hoover, who seemed stiff and defensive, Roosevelt appeared relaxed and accessible. He spoke to farmers in Kansas, workers in Detroit, crowds in Los Angeles. He promised something different without being too specific about what different meant. Hoover tried fighting back. He warned that Roosevelt's vague promises concealed dangerous radicalism that would destroy American freedom. He pointed to his own record of trying to address the Depression through limited federal action. He reminded voters of his competence: engineer, businessman, humanitarian who'd fed Europe after World War I. None of it mattered. Americans were hungry, scared, and angry. They wanted someone who felt their pain, not someone who cited economic theory. Roosevelt won overwhelmingly, 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59. The popular vote was equally decisive, 57% to 40. Democrats swept Congress. Hoover carried just 6 states: Pennsylvania, Delaware, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. The victory margin obscured the real challenge. Roosevelt had no concrete plan. The New Deal was marketing, not policy. Between November and his March inauguration, the banking system continued collapsing. 38 states closed their banks in the final weeks. Hoover begged Roosevelt to issue joint statements to calm panic. Roosevelt refused, unwilling to share blame for Hoover's failures. On March 4, 1933, Roosevelt took the oath as banks closed nationwide. His inaugural address provided what Americans desperately needed: confidence. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Within days, he had declared a bank holiday, halted gold exports, and summoned Congress into special session. His fireside chats, radio addresses delivered in conversational tones, began that same month. He spoke to Americans like a trusted friend, explaining complex problems simply. The tone mattered more than the content. Roosevelt sounded like he knew what he was doing, so Americans believed he did. He'd won the presidency by promising hope. Now he had to deliver it, one experimental program at a time. 1948. Dewey defeats Truman. The Chicago Tribune printed 2 million copies declaring Thomas Dewey the winner. Photographs captured Harry Truman grinning like a carnival barker, holding the newspaper aloft. The headline became history's most famous mistake. Nobody thought Truman could win. Not pollsters, not pundits, not his own party. The Democratic coalition that elected Franklin Roosevelt 4 times had fractured beyond repair. Southern Democrats, furious over Truman's civil rights platform, had bolted to form the state's rights Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats, nominating Strom Thurmond. Progressive Democrats, convinced Truman was too conservative and too anti-Soviet, formed the Progressive Party behind Henry Wallace. Truman faced a 4-way race with his own party split in 3 pieces. Dewey, the Republican governor of New York who'd lost to Roosevelt in 1944, seemed presidential, polished, and inevitable. He ran a cautious campaign, avoiding controversy, making no mistakes, saying almost nothing of substance. Why risk offense when victory was assured? The polls confirmed Dewey's coronation. Gallup, Roper, and Crossley all predicted comfortable Dewey victories. Roper stopped polling in September, declaring the race over. Newsweek surveyed 50 political reporters. All 50 predicted Dewey would win. Life magazine published a photograph of Dewey with the caption, "The next president travels by ferryboat over the broad waters of San Francisco Bay." Truman didn't read the obituaries being written for his campaign. Instead, he boarded a train. The whistle stop tour became legend. From September through November, Truman traveled 31,700 miles, delivering 356 speeches to 6 million people. At small-town train stations, he'd emerge on the rear platform, speak plainly about issues that mattered, and introduce the boss, his wife Bess. Crowds loved him. He attacked the Republican Congress as the do-nothing Congress that had blocked veterans' housing, health care, and aid to education. He painted Dewey and Republicans as tools of special interests. "Give 'em hell, Harry," crowds shouted. Truman replied, "I don't give them hell. I just tell the truth about them, and they think it's hell." Dewey's campaign grew more cautious as Election Day approached. He spoke in platitudes about unity and progress. One observer said Dewey sounded like he was announcing trains rather than running for president. When advised to attack Truman more aggressively, Dewey refused. Why wrestle with a corpse? On election night, early returns favored Dewey. The Chicago Tribune, racing to meet deadlines, printed its infamous front page. Radio announcers declared Dewey the winner. At 2 in the morning, Truman went to bed while still behind. He woke to victory. Final tallies gave Truman 24,179,000 popular votes to Dewey's 21,991,000, a margin of 4.5%. The Electoral College was decisive. 303 for Truman, 189 for Dewey. Thurman carried 4 Deep South states. Wallace won no states at all. Truman had reassembled enough of the Roosevelt coalition: labor, urban ethnics, black voters, farmers, and just enough Southern whites who prioritized economic issues over race. His whistle-stop tour had reached voters the pollsters had stopped counting. The polling failure sparked immediate investigation. What had gone wrong? Several factors emerged. Pollsters had stopped too early, missing late swings. They had sampled by telephone and automobile ownership, missing poorer voters who favored Truman. They'd assumed undecided voters would break for Dewey. But the deeper lesson was simpler. Elections require counting actual votes, not assumed ones. Confidence is not victory. Inevitability is not destiny. Truman returned to that Chicago Tribune photograph repeatedly, waving it gleefully at crowds. The image captured something essential about democracy. Sometimes the experts are wrong, the polls are wrong, the conventional wisdom is wrong, and the people have the final word. Dewey never ran again. He'd lost twice, both times as the favorite. Years later, someone asked what he thought when he saw that photograph. "I was never more embarrassed in my life," he admitted. Truman just kept grinning. 1960, Kennedy versus Nixon on television. The camera loved John Kennedy. It tolerated Richard Nixon. That difference decided the presidency. The first televised presidential debate occurred on September 26, 1960, in Chicago. 70 million Americans watched, the largest television audience in history to that point. What they saw mattered more than what they heard. Kennedy arrived tanned, rested, and confident. He'd spent the previous days campaigning in California, soaking up sun. His dark suit contrasted perfectly against the light studio background. At 43, he looked young, vigorous, and completely at ease. Nixon arrived exhausted. He had spent the previous days campaigning brutally hard, trying to fulfill his promise to visit all 50 states. 2 weeks earlier, he'd banged his knee on a car door, developing an infection that hospitalized him. He'd lost weight. His naturally heavy beard required shaving twice daily, but makeup would make him look weak, so he refused it, or accepted only minimal lazy shave powder that didn't hide his 5 o'clock shadow. His gray suit blended into the gray background, making him appear washed out. He looked sick. The debate's content was substantive. Both candidates discussed Quemoy and the Matsu, Chinese islands in the Taiwan Strait, Cold War strategy, foreign policy, and federal spending. Nixon had more experience. 8 years as vice president gave him deep knowledge. He spoke competently, even brilliantly, about complex issues. But television wasn't about content, it was about image. Kennedy spoke directly to the camera, addressing viewers at home. Nixon spoke to Kennedy or the moderator like he was in a traditional debate. Kennedy appeared confident, his body language open. Nixon looked uncomfortable, sweating under the studio lights, shifting nervously, his eyes darting. Radio listeners, roughly 2 million, thought Nixon won based on substance and argument. Television viewers, 68 million, thought Kennedy demolished him. The visual contrast was devastating. Kennedy looked presidential. Nixon looked like someone who needed rest. Kennedy seemed to belong. Nixon seemed to struggle. None of this was fair. Nixon was actually the more experienced candidate, but fairness mattered less than perception. The campaigns recognized television's power immediately. Kennedy's team scheduled 3 more debates, knowing their candidate had found his advantage. Nixon's team tried damage control, better makeup, better suits, better lighting. The subsequent debates looked more even, but the damage was done. The election itself proved brutally close. Kennedy won the popular vote by barely more than 100,000 votes out of 68 million cast, a margin of 0.2%. The Electoral College was more comfortable, 303 to 219, though several states were decided by razor-thin margins. Illinois and Texas, both crucial to Kennedy's victory, faced allegations of voter fraud. In Illinois, Chicago's Democratic machine, led by Mayor Richard Daley, delivered the state by 8,858 votes. Republicans claimed dead people had voted, that ballots had been stuffed, that the count was stolen. Nixon refused to contest the results, unwilling to put the country through a crisis. Texas went Democratic by 46,000 votes, with similar fraud allegations in heavily Democratic counties. Again, Nixon declined to fight. Whether fraud occurred remained disputed. What was undisputed? Television had changed politics permanently. Image mattered. Performance mattered. Candidates needed to master the medium or it would destroy them. The 1960 election marked the beginning of modern political communication. Handlers would now obsess over lighting, makeup, clothing, and camera angles. Substance still mattered, but delivery mattered more. A candidate could win on policy and lose on perspiration. Kennedy understood this instinctively. He'd grown up with cameras, comfortable being watched. His inaugural address, delivered in freezing January weather, became iconic partly because he looked so good delivering it. Hatless, coatless, radiating youth and vigor. Nixon learned the lesson but never mastered it. 8 years later, he'd win the presidency, but only after reinventing his image completely. The 1960 debates proved that democracy in the television age required different skills than democracy in the newspaper age. Voters still chose, but they chose based on what they saw, not just what they heard or read. The medium had become the message. 1968, protest and pandemonium, tear gas in Grant Park, the whole world watching. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago became the week American politics descended into televised chaos. 1968 was a year of apocalypse. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April. Robert Kennedy was murdered in June, just after winning the California primary. Cities burned. Vietnam killed hundreds of Americans weekly with no end visible. The country felt like it was tearing itself apart. President Lyndon Johnson, exhausted and despised, had announced in March that he wouldn't seek re-election. Vice President Hubert Humphrey entered the race late, skipping primaries but collecting endorsements from party bosses and elected officials. He represented the establishment, the status quo, the continuation of Johnson's Vietnam policy. Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy had contested the primaries, running as anti-war candidates. Kennedy's assassination left McCarthy as the progressive standard-bearer, but he lacked Kennedy's charisma and organization. The Democratic Party remained controlled by machines and bosses, who'd deliver their delegates to Humphrey. 10,000 anti-war protesters descended on Chicago for the August convention. They were young, idealistic, and furious. They'd watched their candidates win primaries only to be ignored by party elites. They'd watched friends die in Vietnam for a war their government lied about. They came to Chicago demanding the party listen. Chicago's Mayor Richard Daley prepared for war. He deployed 12,000 police officers, plus 6,000 National Guard troops, and 7,500 Army soldiers. He refused permits for protesters to sleep in parks or march near the convention. His message was clear. Chicago belonged to him, not hippies. The convention itself, held at the International Amphitheater, excluded many McCarthy delegates through credentials challenges. Inside, party bosses controlled proceedings. The platform committee rejected a peace plank on Vietnam. Humphrey's nomination was foreordained. Outside, protesters and police collided repeatedly. On Wednesday, August 28th, as delegates nominated Humphrey inside, police attacked demonstrators in Grant Park. They used tear gas, billy clubs, and raw violence. They beat protesters, journalists, and bystanders indiscriminately. Demonstrators chanted, "The whole world is watching." They were right. Television cameras captured everything. Networks split screens showing Humphrey's nomination inside, while police brutalized citizens outside. Americans watched from their living rooms as democracy devolved into riot. CBS anchor Walter Cronkite, normally unflappable, said, "I think we've got a bunch of thugs here." Connecticut Senator Abraham Ribicoff, nominating George McGovern, condemned Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago, while Daley screamed obscenities from the convention floor. Delegates wept. Some tried to march out in protest. The convention descended into chaos that television broadcast live. The violence continued through the night. Police charged into the Hilton Hotel, beating people in the lobby. They arrested hundreds. A government commission would later label it a police riot. Uncontrolled violence by law enforcement against citizens exercising constitutional rights. Humphrey won the nomination but lost the narrative. His campaign began with the Democratic Party looking like a war zone. Republicans, meeting weeks earlier in Miami, had nominated Richard Nixon in a carefully choreographed convention. The contrast was devastating. Nixon ran on law and order, promising to restore peace and end the chaos. His campaign focused on the silent majority, Americans horrified by protests, riots, and disorder. George Wallace, running as an independent, appealed to similar voters with barely coded racism and authoritarian promises. Humphrey, tainted by association with Johnson's Vietnam policy and Chicago's violence, campaigned desperately. He finally broke with Johnson on Vietnam in late September, but the damage was done. He closed the gap in October, but time ran out. Nixon won narrowly, 31,783,000 popular votes to Humphrey's 31,271,000, a margin of 0.7%. Wallace captured 13.5%. The Electoral College gave Nixon 301 votes to Humphrey's 191. Chicago had cost Democrats the presidency. Television had shown Americans their party devouring itself while police beat their children. The convention proved that controlling the message mattered less than controlling the reality, because television broadcast reality directly into living rooms. The whole world had watched, and it had recoiled. 1972, landslide, and listening devices. Richard Nixon won 49 states, 17 million popular votes, 520 electoral votes, 217. It was the second largest landslide in American history. It was also built on crime. By 1972, Nixon had repositioned himself from the sweating, uncomfortable figure of 1960 to confident statesman. He'd opened relations with China, pursued détente with the Soviet Union, and begun withdrawing troops from Vietnam while bombing Cambodia and Laos. He'd positioned himself as the peace candidate who'd end the war honorably. Democrats nominated George McGovern, a South Dakota senator and genuine war hero who'd flown 35 bomber missions in World War II. McGovern ran as an unabashed liberal, immediate withdrawal from Vietnam, guaranteed income for all Americans, amnesty for draft dodgers, and deep defense cuts. The Democratic Convention in Miami had adopted new rules to include more women, minorities, and young people as delegates. The result was a diverse, chaotic gathering that alienated traditional party bosses and union leaders. McGovern won the nomination, but delivered his acceptance speech at 2:30 in the morning, far too late for television audiences. McGovern's campaign stumbled immediately. His running mate, Missouri Senator Thomas Eagleton, revealed he'd received electroshock therapy for depression. After initially supporting Eagleton 1,000%, McGovern forced him off the ticket, making McGovern look both disloyal and indecisive. Sergeant Shriver replaced Eagleton, but the damage lingered. Nixon barely campaigned. He remained presidential, appearing in carefully staged events while surrogates attacked McGovern as radical, weak, and un-American. They labeled him the candidate of acid, amnesty, and abortion. They painted him as outside mainstream American values. The Nixon campaign had money, enormous amounts of it, some legal, much not. Corporate executives donated illegally. Foreign contributions flowed in. The committee to re-elect the president, inevitably nicknamed CREEP, spent millions on advertising, opposition research, and dirty tricks. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested breaking into Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex in Washington. They carried cameras and wiretapping equipment. They were connected to CREEP. The story barely registered. The Washington Post assigned 2 young reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, to investigate. They found connections to Nixon's re-election committee, then to White House staff, but their stories ran inside the paper. Most Americans never noticed. Election day produced a massacre. Nixon won 60.7% of the popular vote, 47,169,000 votes to McGovern's 29,170,000. McGovern carried only Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. Even his home state of South Dakota voted for Nixon. It seemed like vindication. Nixon had won the largest victory margin in history. He'd secured a mandate. The protesters, the liberals, the anti-war movement, all crushed. But Woodward and Bernstein kept digging. Throughout 1973, revelations emerged. Hush money paid to burglars, White House cover-ups, enemies lists, illegal wiretaps, obstruction of justice. The Senate held televised hearings. White House counsel John Dean testified that Nixon directed the cover-up. The smoking gun emerged in August 1974. Tape recordings Nixon made of all Oval Office conversations proved he'd ordered the cover-up 6 days after the break-in. The Supreme Court ordered him to release the tapes. Republicans abandoned him. On August 9, 1974, Nixon resigned, the first president ever to do so. His landslide victory had lasted less than 2 years. Before collapsing under the weight of its own corruption, the 1972 election proved that winning doesn't equal legitimacy, that power obtained through crime remains crime, and that democracy eventually holds leaders accountable. It took time, too much time, but the system functioned. McGovern had lost 49 states, but won the argument. Nixon had won everything but destroyed himself. The landslide became a cautionary tale. Elections measure momentary preference, but history measures character. The listening devices that won Nixon his victory became the evidence that ended his presidency. 1976, Carter and the post-Watergate cleanse. Jimmy Carter smiled constantly. That smile, slightly awkward, undeniably genuine, became his greatest asset and his defining image. America in 1976 was exhausted and cynical. Nixon's resignation had exposed systematic corruption. Vietnam had ended in humiliating defeat. The economy suffered from stagflation, high unemployment plus high inflation that violated every economic theory. Trust in government had collapsed. Carter, a one term Georgia governor and peanut farmer, offered something politicians rarely provide: honesty. "I will never lie to you," he promised repeatedly. After Nixon's constant deception, that simple pledge resonated. He was a genuine outsider. He'd served one term as governor and had no Washington connections. He was unknown nationally when he announced his candidacy in 1974. Political insiders dismissed him. "Jimmy who?" became the running joke. But Carter understood post-Watergate America better than the insiders. He ran against Washington itself, against the corruption and cronyism that had brought Nixon down. He portrayed himself as a simple man with simple values: faith, family, integrity, who would restore honor to the presidency. His primary campaign was brilliant. He entered every primary, worked constantly, and positioned himself as both Southern conservative and progressive reformer. He won Iowa through sheer effort, gained momentum, and survived challenges from liberal icon Henry Scoop Jackson and Alabama Governor George Wallace. By the Democratic Convention in New York, Carter had secured the nomination. His acceptance speech emphasized themes of restoration. "It is now a time for healing. We want to have faith again." Republicans nominated Gerald Ford, who would become president when Nixon resigned. Ford had pardoned Nixon a month after taking office, a deeply unpopular decision he justified as necessary to help the country move forward. That pardon haunted him. Ford seemed decent but unelected. He'd been appointed vice president when Spiro Agnew resigned, then inherited the presidency. He'd never won a national election. His biggest liability was the Nixon connection. His greatest asset was incumbency. The campaign focused on character and trust. Carter emphasized his outsider status and moral clarity. Ford pointed to his experience and steady leadership. Their debates, the first since 1960, revealed Ford's strengths and weaknesses. In the second debate, Ford inexplicably claimed, "There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe." The gaffe suggested he was out of touch. Carter's campaign hit obstacles. A Playboy interview where he admitted, "I've committed adultery in my heart many times," seemed bizarre for a presidential candidate. His sometimes sanctimonious tone irritated voters. Questions arose about his competence and specific policy positions, but Watergate's shadow remained decisive. Americans wanted someone untainted, someone who represented a break from the recent past. Carter's smile, his openness about faith, his small-town background, all conveyed decency. The election was close. Carter won 50% to Ford's 48% in the popular vote, a margin of roughly 1,700,000 votes. The Electoral College was tighter than expected, 297 to 240. If Ford had won Ohio and Hawaii, he'd have won re-election. Carter's victory coalition was revealing. He won the South, black voters overwhelmingly, Northern liberals, and working-class Catholics. He'd reassembled pieces of the Roosevelt coalition that had been fracturing for decades. His inauguration emphasized populism and humility. He and his family walked from the Capitol to the White House rather than riding in limousines, the first president to do so. He wore an ordinary business suit, not formal wear. He wanted to be the people's president. America exhaled. The post-Watergate cleanse had produced a winner whose greatest qualification was that he seemed incapable of the crimes his predecessor had committed. The bar for presidential character had dropped so low that basic honesty became revolutionary. Carter's presidency would prove that honesty without effectiveness isn't enough, that moral clarity without political skill leads to failure. But in 1976, Americans weren't thinking ahead. They were grateful for a president whose smile seemed genuine. After years of lies, that was enough. 1980, Reagan and the return of optimism. Ronald Reagan asked one question that demolished Jimmy Carter's presidency. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Americans answered with their votes. Carter had entered office promising competence and honesty. 4 years later, he delivered honesty but not competence. Inflation raged above 13%. Unemployment topped 7%. Interest rates hit 20%, making mortgages unaffordable. Gas lines snaked around blocks. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. 52 American hostages remained captive in Iran, held since November 1979. Carter had addressed the nation's problems with brutal honesty. In July 1979, he delivered a speech diagnosing a crisis of confidence in America. The media called it his malaise speech, though he never used that word. He told Americans they had become too materialistic, too selfish, too lacking in faith. They needed to rediscover community and sacrifice. Americans didn't want lectures, they wanted solutions. Reagan, the 69-year-old former California governor and Hollywood actor, offered something Carter couldn't: optimism. Where Carter saw limits, Reagan saw possibilities. Where Carter urged sacrifice, Reagan promised renewal. "It's morning again in America" became his campaign theme. Reagan's opponents in both the primary and general election underestimated him. They saw an aging actor who told simplistic stories. They mocked his age, his memory lapses, his reliance on note cards. They called him shallow, dangerous, a warmonger who'd start nuclear war. They missed his genius. Reagan understood television better than any politician since Kennedy. He'd spent decades in front of cameras and knew how to connect emotionally. His speeches told stories that made complex issues feel simple. He spoke about America as a shining city on a hill, a beacon of hope, a nation of unlimited potential. His debate performance against Carter 1 week before the election sealed the victory. Carter tried attacking Reagan's positions, suggesting he was reckless and extremist. Reagan deflected with charm, saying, "There you go again," in a tone that made Carter seem mean-spirited. Then came the knockout. Ask yourself, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Millions of Americans watching knew the answer was no. Reagan promised to cut taxes, increase defense spending, and balance the budget simultaneously. Economists called this impossible. Reagan's budget director would later admit the numbers didn't work. But in the campaign, Reagan sold optimism, not mathematics. Carter's campaign grew desperate. They painted Reagan as a dangerous radical who'd undo civil rights, destroy Social Security, and trigger nuclear war. Attack ads showed missiles launching while ominous music played. Nothing worked. On Election Day, the hostage crisis continued. Carter had authorized a military rescue mission that failed catastrophically in April, with 8 servicemen dying when helicopters crashed in the Iranian desert. The humiliation was complete. Reagan won overwhelmingly. 43,904,000 popular votes to Carter's 35,483,000, a margin of nearly 10%. The Electoral College was a landslide, 489 to 49. Carter carried only 6 states and the District of Columbia. Republicans also captured the Senate for the first time since 1954. Several liberal Democratic senators lost, victims of negative campaigns run by new conservative organizations using direct mail and television ads. The new right had arrived. Reagan's inauguration occurred precisely when Iran released the hostages, after 444 days of captivity. Whether Reagan's campaign had secretly negotiated with Iran to delay release remained controversial, but the timing was symbolic. Carter's failure became Reagan's triumph. Reagan's presidency would prove polarizing. His economic policies, massive tax cuts combined with defense spending increases, exploded the deficit. His optimism masked serious social problems. His administration sold arms to Iran and used proceeds to fund Nicaraguan rebels illegally. But in 1980, Americans didn't care about future scandals. They wanted someone who believed America could be great again, who promised prosperity wasn't gone forever, who made them feel good about their country. Reagan's smile was as important as his policies. His voice, warm, confident, reassuring, made people believe things would improve. After Carter's grim honesty, Reagan's cheerful certainty felt like relief. Democracy had chosen optimism over realism, hope over honesty. Morning had come to America. Whether it would last was another question. 1992, Clinton, Bush, and Perot-Ross. Perot bought 30-minute blocks of television time and used them to show charts. Millions of Americans watched. That detail captures how strange the 1992 election became. George H.W. Bush had seemed invincible. 18 months earlier, he'd won the Gulf War in 100 hours, liberating Kuwait and crushing Saddam Hussein's army. His approval ratings topped 90%. Democrats despaired of finding anyone willing to run against him. But Bush made a fatal mistake: the economy. A recession began in 1990, and Bush seemed oblivious. At a grocery store photo opportunity, he appeared amazed by a barcode scanner, technology that had existed for years. The incident, whether fairly reported or not, made him seem disconnected from ordinary American life. Democrats nominated Bill Clinton, Arkansas governor, and the most talented politician of his generation. Clinton had survived scandals that would have destroyed most candidates. Allegations of infidelity, draft dodging accusations, and questions about marijuana use. He'd admitted on television that his marriage had problems, discussing issues no presidential candidate had ever addressed publicly. Clinton had one message: "It's the economy, stupid." His campaign headquarters in Little Rock had a sign with that phrase prominently displayed. Every speech, every policy, every attack refocused on economic anxiety. Bush wanted to discuss foreign policy. Clinton dragged the conversation back to jobs and wages. Then Perot entered. Ross Perot, a Texas billionaire who'd made his fortune in data processing, announced his candidacy on Larry King Live in February. He wasn't a traditional politician. He was short, spoke in a Texas twang, and used folksy metaphors. But he tapped into deep frustration with both parties. Perot's message was simple: government was broken, politicians were corrupt, and the national debt was destroying America's future. He showed charts, actual charts, with numbers and graphs, on television. He bought half-hour infomercials and walked viewers through the federal budget. Incredibly, people watched and liked it. His appeal crossed party lines. Republicans who thought Bush had broken his "read my lips, no new taxes" promise supported Perot. Democrats disgusted with politics, as usual, supported Perot. Independents frustrated with both parties supported Perot. By June, polls showed him leading both Bush and Clinton. Then Perot quit. In July, he abruptly withdrew, claiming Republican operatives planned to disrupt his daughter's wedding. The excuse seemed paranoid. His support collapsed, flowing primarily to Clinton. But in October, Perot unquit. He re-entered the race, claiming he'd left because the Republican Party had threatened him, but returned because neither Bush nor Clinton addressed the debt crisis. He bought more infomercials, showed more charts, and participated in all three presidential debates. The debates showcased three completely different candidates. Bush seemed tired and kept checking his watch, as if bored. Clinton felt voters' pain, literally saying, "I feel your pain," when addressing struggling Americans. Perot brought props and spoke in metaphors about cars and engines. Clinton won comfortably, 43% to Bush's 37%. Perot captured 19%, the strongest third party showing since Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. Clinton's electoral college margin was large, 370 to 168. But the popular vote revealed a fractured electorate. 57% of Americans had voted against Clinton. Perot hadn't won a single state or electoral vote, but he'd proven that outsider candidates could reshape races. His focus on the deficit forced both parties to address fiscal issues they'd preferred ignoring. Perot's campaign pioneered direct appeals to voters through media buys, bypassing traditional party structures. His infomercials proved that Americans would watch substantive, political content if presented clearly. His charts became iconic, proof that data and policy could engage voters, not just emotional appeals. The 1992 election demonstrated that three-way races produced strange mathematics and unpredictable outcomes. It showed that economic anxiety trumps foreign policy success. Most importantly, it proved that personality and unconventional approaches could attract millions of voters disgusted with traditional politics. Clinton entered office with a mandate despite winning less than half the vote. Perot returned to private life but remained politically active, forming the Reform Party and running again in 1996 with less success. The message stuck. Americans wanted something different, even if they couldn't quite agree on what different meant. 2000. The Florida recount. For 36 days, America didn't know who'd won the presidency. The world watched as the most powerful nation on earth counted and recounted ballots, argued over hanging chads, and waited for courts to decide what democracy meant. Al Gore, Clinton's vice president, faced George W. Bush, the Texas governor and son of the 41st president. The campaign was unremarkable, both candidates centrist, both promising prosperity, neither particularly inspiring. Gore emphasized his experience, Bush emphasized his likability. Election night, November 7th, 2000, began normally. Networks called states as results arrived. Florida, with its 25 electoral votes, would determine the winner. Early exit polls favored Gore. At 7:50 p.m. Eastern, networks called Florida for Gore. Except the call was wrong. Florida's panhandle, in the central time zone, still had polls open. Many residents hadn't voted yet. Networks retracted the call. Hours passed. Around 2 a.m., networks called Florida and the presidency for Bush. Gore called Bush to concede. Gore's motorcade departed for his public concession speech. Then Gore's team noticed something. The Florida margin was narrowing. It had dropped below 1,000 votes. Florida law required automatic recounts when margins were that close. Gore called Bush again, retracting his concession. Bush reportedly replied, "You mean to tell me, Mr. Vice President, you're retracting your concession?" Networks retracted their call. Nobody knew who won. Florida's vote count descended into chaos. The initial machine recount showed Bush ahead by 327 votes out of nearly 6 million cast. But problems emerged everywhere. Palm Beach County had used a confusing butterfly ballot where candidate names appeared on both sides of a central punch column. Thousands of elderly Jewish voters apparently punched the wrong hole, accidentally voting for Pat Buchanan, a candidate accused of anti-Semitism, instead of Gore. Buchanan himself admitted the votes were likely mistakes. Across Florida, punch card ballots revealed hanging chads, pieces of paper not fully detached when voters punched holes. Some hung by one corner, some by two. Some were merely dimpled, showing indentations but no holes. Did these count as votes? If so, for whom? Gore's team requested manual recounts in 4 heavily Democratic counties. Bush's team sued to stop them. Florida's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, a Republican who'd co-chaired Bush's Florida campaign, set deadlines for certifications and rejected late counts. The Florida Supreme Court dominated by Democratic appointees, ordered recounts to continue and extended deadlines. Bush's team appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Protesters descended on Miami-Dade County as officials conducted recounts, later called the Brooks Brothers riot. Republican operatives disrupted the count so aggressively that officials halted the recount. Many of the protesters turned out to be Republican congressional staffers flown to Florida. On December 8th, the Florida Supreme Court ordered a statewide manual recount of all undervotes, ballots where machines detected no presidential vote. Bush's lead had shrunk to 154 votes. Bush appealed again to the U.S. Supreme Court. On December 9th, the court halted the recount. On December 12th, in Bush v. Gore, the court ruled 5-4 that continuing the recount violated equal protection because different counties used different standards for evaluating ballots. The recount stopped. Bush's 154-vote lead stood. Gore conceded the next day. "While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it," he said. He'd won the national popular vote by approximately 500,000 votes, 48.4% to 47.9%, but lost the Electoral College 271 to 266. Bush versus Gore became one of the most controversial Supreme Court decisions ever. The 5-justice majority were all Republican appointees. Their reasoning, that equal protection required stopping the recount, seemed designed to reach a predetermined outcome. The majority even stated their decision should not be considered precedent. The 36-day crisis tested American democracy. Some feared civil unrest or constitutional crisis. Instead, Gore conceded peacefully. The system held, barely. Later analyses suggested that if the statewide recount had continued using various standards, Bush would likely have won anyway, but by different margins depending on methodology. The true outcome remained unknowable. The 2000 election proved that elections could be so close that determining winners became impossible. It showed that voting technology mattered desperately. It demonstrated that courts, not voters, might make final decisions. Democracy survived, but barely, and only because the loser chose to accept defeat for the country's sake. 2008. Hope on the web. Obama raised $746 million, mostly in small donations collected online. That sentence doesn't capture how revolutionary it was. Presidential campaigns had always depended on wealthy donors and large contributions. Candidates courted millionaires at intimate dinners. They promised access in exchange for checks. Obama's campaign proved a different model. Millions of ordinary Americans giving $25 or $50 each through a website. Obama announced his candidacy in February 2007 in Springfield, Illinois, where Lincoln had practiced law. The symbolism was deliberate. At 45, he was young, biracial, with an unusual name and thin resume. 1 term in the Senate, 8 years in the Illinois legislature. He'd given an electrifying keynote address at the 2004 Democratic Convention. But keynote addresses don't usually lead to presidencies. His primary opponent was Hillary Clinton, former First Lady and New York Senator. She was experienced, connected, and inevitably the nominee. Political insiders called the primary a coronation. They were wrong. Obama's campaign manager, David Plouffe, and his chief strategist, David Axelrod, built something unprecedented. They hired Facebook co-founder Chris Hughes to create mybarackobama.com, a social networking site for supporters to organize themselves. They collected email addresses obsessively. They sent millions of personalized messages asking for small donations. The campaign used data analytics to identify persuadable voters and deployed volunteers precisely. They organized supporters through social media before organizing through social media became standard. They created content designed to be shared virally. Obama's slogan, "Yes, we can," became a chant, a song, and a meme. "Will.i.am of the Black-Eyed Peas produced a music video featuring celebrities repeating, "Yes, we can." It was viewed millions of times on YouTube. The campaign hadn't created it, supporters did. Clinton's campaign was traditional: hire consultants, run television ads, rely on big donors and endorsements. Obama's was decentralized: empower supporters, raise money online, use data to target voters individually. Obama won Iowa's caucus despite Clinton's inevitability. Young voters and first-time caucus goers showed up in unprecedented numbers. Clinton won New Hampshire, but Obama won the long war. His organizational superiority in caucus states gradually built a delegate lead Clinton couldn't overcome. By June, Obama had secured the Democratic nomination, the first African-American major party nominee. His acceptance speech in Denver attracted 84,000 people to an outdoor stadium and drew massive television audiences. Republicans nominated John McCain, a 72-year-old Arizona senator and Vietnam War hero. McCain represented experience, military service, and maverick independence. His campaign emphasized Obama's inexperience and questionable associations. Then the economy collapsed. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers failed, triggering global financial crisis. The stock market crashed. Banks teetered on insolvency. The Bush administration proposed a $700 billion bailout. McCain suspended his campaign to return to Washington for negotiations, then unsuspended when negotiations continued without him. Obama remained calm, projecting competence. McCain seemed erratic. One debate moment crystallized the contrast. McCain wandered the stage looking uncomfortable. Obama appeared presidential. Obama's ground game proved devastating. His campaign had field offices in states Democrats hadn't contested in decades. They registered millions of new voters. On Election Day, their data operation identified exactly which supporters hadn't voted yet and sent volunteers to knock on their doors. The turnout operation was unprecedented. Obama won 365 electoral votes to McCain's 173. He flipped Indiana, North Carolina, Virginia, Florida, Ohio, and Colorado, states Democrats had recently lost. He won 53% of the popular vote, 69,498,000 votes, the most any presidential candidate had ever received. Obama's victory proved that campaigns could be built on small donors and digital organizing. It demonstrated that social media and data analytics had become essential. It showed that engaging young voters through technology could overcome traditional advantages. His inauguration drew unprecedented crowds to Washington. The symbolism of America's first black president taking the oath resonated globally. His campaign had promised hope and change. Now he had to deliver. The 2008 election marked democracy's entry into the digital age. Campaigns would never again rely primarily on television and traditional organizing. The future belonged to data, social media, email, and online fundraising. Obama had used technology to win. Now every subsequent campaign would race to master whatever came next. 2016, the algorithm age. The polls were wrong. The experts were wrong. The conventional wisdom was wrong. Donald Trump became president, and nobody in Washington saw it coming. Trump descended his golden escalator at Trump Tower on June 16, 2015, to announce his candidacy. Political insiders laughed. A reality television star with no political experience, multiple bankruptcies, and a habit of saying offensive things wasn't a serious candidate. He was a publicity stunt. The Republican primary field was strong. Senators, governors, policy experts. Jeb Bush, the establishment favorite, raised over $100 million before voting began. Trump dominated news coverage by saying provocative things, calling Mexican immigrants rapists, proposing a ban on Muslim immigration, mocking a disabled reporter, feuding with Fox News anchor Megyn Kelly. Traditional politicians condemned him. Mainstream Republicans tried ignoring him. Nothing worked. Trump won primary after primary, defeating 16 opponents through dominance of news cycles and connections with working class voters who felt ignored by both parties. Democrats nominated Hillary Clinton after a surprisingly competitive primary against Bernie Sanders, a Democratic socialist senator from Vermont. Sanders energized young voters and progressives, but Clinton had stronger support among older voters, black voters, and party leadership. She became the first female major party nominee. The general election campaign was bizarre. Trump held rallies where crowds chanted "lock her up" about Clinton. He refused to release tax returns. A videotape emerged of Trump bragging about sexually assaulting women. Commentators declared his campaign dead. Clinton campaigned traditionally: policy papers, endorsements, television ads, data-driven turnout operations. She led in virtually every poll. Models gave her 80 to 98% probability of winning. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. In July, WikiLeaks released emails stolen from the Democratic National Committee's servers. Intelligence agencies later concluded that Russian intelligence had hacked the DNC and provided emails to WikiLeaks. The emails showed party officials favoring Clinton over Sanders, reinforcing suspicions that the primary was rigged. Throughout the fall, WikiLeaks released more stolen emails, including some from Clinton campaign chairman John Podesta. Mainstream media covered the contents while barely mentioning the hack's source. Trump repeatedly cited WikiLeaks at rallies. On October 28th, 11 days before the election, FBI Director James Comey announced he was reopening the investigation into Clinton's private email server. The announcement dominated headlines. 2 days before the election, Comey announced nothing new had been found, but damage was done. Meanwhile, Facebook had become America's primary news source. Its algorithm determined what users saw, creating personalized information environments. Russian operatives created fake accounts and pages that spread false information to millions. Conspiracy theories about Clinton spread virally. True and false became indistinguishable in many users' feeds. Election night shocked the world. Trump won Michigan by 10,000 votes, Wisconsin by 22,000, Pennsylvania by 44,000. Those 3 states gave him victory. Clinton won the popular vote by 2,864,000, 48% to 46%, but lost the Electoral College 306 to 232. The polling failure sparked immediate analysis. Pollsters had missed non-college educated white voters, especially in Midwest states. Response rates had dropped so low that samples were unreliable. People lied to pollsters about supporting Trump because of social desirability bias. But the deeper story was how information flowed. Facebook's algorithm had created echo chambers where people saw only confirming information. Russian interference had exploited these systems. Traditional gatekeepers, newspapers, fact-checkers, editors had lost control of information distribution. Cambridge Analytica, a political consulting firm, claimed to have harvested data from millions of Facebook users without permission and used it to target voters with personalized content. Whether this affected the outcome remained disputed, but it revealed how digital campaigns could micro-target voters based on psychological profiles. Trump's victory proved that media fragmentation and social media algorithms had changed politics fundamentally. Campaigns no longer needed to persuade most Americans, only specific voters in specific states. Traditional media coverage mattered less than viral content. Saying provocative things that dominated news cycles could substitute for organized ground operations. Democracy in the algorithm age faced new challenges: foreign interference, information warfare, filter bubbles, micro-targeting, and platforms designed to maximize engagement rather than inform users. The 2016 election revealed these vulnerabilities but provided no solutions. The polls had been wrong because the electorate had changed. Traditional models couldn't capture voters' behavior when information itself had become weaponized. 2020. Voting in a pandemic, Americans voted during a plague. Democracy didn't pause for disease, it adapted. COVID-19 arrived in America in early 2020. By March, the country had shut down. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, hospitals overwhelmed, morgues filled. The death toll climbed toward hundreds of thousands. The economy collapsed faster than during the Great Depression. President Donald Trump faced re-election during the worst crisis since World War II. His response had been erratic, downplaying the virus initially, suggesting unproven treatments, feuding with governors, undermining his own health officials. His approval ratings remained underwater. Democrats nominated Joe Biden, the 77-year-old former vice president. Biden had run for president twice before and lost both times. But Democrats in 2020 wanted safety, not excitement. Biden represented stability, competence, and normalcy. The campaign was unlike any previous election. Biden barely left his Delaware home, conducting a basement campaign through Zoom calls and limited outdoor events. Trump held rallies, often indoors, where few wore masks. The contrast was stark. Trump projecting strength through defying health guidelines, Biden projecting responsibility through following them. The central question became, how do you hold elections during a pandemic? Mail-in voting became essential. States expanded absentee ballot access. Some sent ballots to all registered voters. Early voting expanded. Drop boxes appeared across cities. Trump attacked mail-in voting relentlessly. He claimed without evidence that mail ballots enabled massive fraud. He suggested the election was being rigged against him. He undermined confidence in the process itself. Republican state legislatures in several states refused to allow counting mail ballots before Election Day. This created a red mirage. Early results showing Trump ahead because Election Day votes, predominantly Republican, were counted first, with mail ballots, predominantly Democratic, counted later. More Americans voted in 2020 than any previous election. 158,400,000. 66% turnout, the highest since 1900. About 46% voted by mail or absentee. Many waited in lines for hours wearing masks. Democracy persevered despite disease. Election night showed Trump ahead in key states. Trump declared victory prematurely, demanding that vote counting stop. But counting continued. Over subsequent days, Biden's margins in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada grew as mail ballots were tallied. On November 7th, networks called Pennsylvania and the presidency for Biden. He'd won 306 electoral votes to Trump's 232, the exact margin Trump had won by in 2016. Biden's popular vote margin was substantial, 81 million to 74 million, a difference of 7 million. Trump refused to concede. He filed dozens of lawsuits alleging fraud. Courts dismissed them systematically. More than 60 cases lost. Judges appointed by Republicans ruled against him. His own attorney general said there was no evidence of fraud affecting the outcome. Trump's legal team, led by Rudy Giuliani, held press conferences making wild accusations. Dead people voting, trucks of fake ballots, voting machines changing votes. They provided no credible evidence. A press conference at Four Seasons Total Landscaping, booked apparently by mistake instead of the Four Seasons Hotel, became a symbol of the campaign's desperation. On December 8th, the safe harbor deadline passed, cementing Biden's win. State officials certified results. The Electoral College met on December 14th and confirmed Biden's victory. Trump still refused to accept it. On January 6, 2021, Congress met to certify the Electoral College results. Trump held a rally near the Capitol, telling supporters to fight like hell or they wouldn't have a country anymore. A mob stormed the Capitol, forcing Congress to evacuate. 5 people died. It was the first breach of the Capitol since the War of 1812. Congress reconvened that evening and completed certification. Trump finally acknowledged that a new administration would take office, but never explicitly conceded. Biden was inaugurated on January 20th behind unprecedented security, 25,000 National Guard troops, fencing, and checkpoints. Trump refused to attend, the first president since Andrew Johnson to skip his successor's inauguration. The 2020 election proved democracy could function during crisis, but at great cost. Misinformation corroded trust. Violence had erupted at the Capitol. Millions of Americans believed, despite all evidence, that the election was stolen. Democracy survived, but it had been stress-tested to near breaking, and the damage to trust might take generations to repair. Faithless electors and the limits of loyalty. The Electoral College is built on trust. 308 times since 1789, that trust held. 165 times it didn't. Faithless electors, members of the Electoral College who vote for someone other than their pledged candidate, have existed since the beginning. The Constitution gives electors discretion. They're not mere rubber stamps, but independent actors charged with choosing the president. At least, that was the theory. The first faithless elector appeared in 1796. Samuel Miles, a Federalist elector from Pennsylvania, was pledged to John Adams but voted for Thomas Jefferson. His constituents weren't amused. One newspaper published, "What, do I choose Samuel Miles to determine for me whether John Adams or Thomas Jefferson is the fittest man for president? No. I choose him to act, not to think." Over the next 2 centuries, faithless electors appeared sporadically. In 1808, 6 New York electors abandoned James Madison. In 1812, 3 electors defected. Most went unnoticed because they didn't change outcomes. 1968 produced a deliberate attempt at faithlessness. Lloyd W. Bailey, a Republican elector from North Carolina, refused to vote for Richard Nixon despite Nixon winning the state. Bailey voted for George Wallace instead, explaining he couldn't support Nixon's liberal positions on civil rights and communism. In 1976, a Washington state elector pledged to Gerald Ford instead voted for Ronald Reagan. Mike Patton wanted to encourage Reagan to run in 1980. His vote changed nothing. Jimmy Carter won anyway. But it demonstrated electors' independence. 2000 produced more defections. One Democratic elector from Washington, D.C., Barbara Lett Simmons, left her ballot blank rather than vote for Al Gore. She was protesting D.C.'s lack of congressional representation. If the election hadn't been decided by courts instead of electors, her vote might have mattered. 2016 saw the most faithless electors in over a century. 10 electors attempted to vote for someone other than their pledged candidate. 7 succeeded after 3 were replaced or forced to revote by state law. 5 Democratic electors in Washington and Hawaii refused to vote for Hillary Clinton. 3 voted for Colin Powell, 1 for Bernie Sanders, 1 for Faith Spotted Eagle, a Native American activist. 2 Texas Republican electors refused to vote for Donald Trump, choosing Ron Paul and John Kasich instead. The movement, called the Hamilton Electors, hoped to deny Trump a majority and throw the election to the House. It failed spectacularly. Trump lost 2 electoral votes, but won anyway. Clinton lost more electors than Trump. The irony was thick. These defections sparked legal challenges. Washington state had fined its faithless electors $1,000 each. The electors sued, arguing the Constitution gave them discretion. The case reached the Supreme Court. In July 2020, Chiafalo v. Washington settled the question. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that states may enforce pledges and punish faithless electors. Justice Elena Kagan's opinion explained that while the Constitution doesn't explicitly bind electors, states have authority to require faithfulness. The decision was pragmatic. If electors could vote freely, the Electoral College would be even more undemocratic and unpredictable. Presidential campaigns would need to persuade not just voters, but individual electors, opening doors to bribery, intimidation, and chaos. The Chiafalo decision essentially ended faithless electors as a meaningful phenomenon. States quickly passed or strengthened laws binding electors to their pledges. Future defections would be stopped or punished. But the episode revealed the Electoral College's fundamental weirdness. The presidency is decided not by citizens directly, but by intermediaries meeting in state capitals. The system relies on norms, laws, and good faith, all of which can break down. Faithless electors never changed a presidential outcome. They remain historical curiosities, footnotes in election results. But they prove that democracy's machinery has moving parts, human elements that can malfunction. The Electoral College is a machine built on trust. When trust fails, rules must substitute. The 2020 Supreme Court decision provided those rules, finally answering a question the founders left ambiguous. Electors are chosen to think, but in modern America, they're chosen to obey. The rise of polling and the science of guessing. George Gallup promised he could predict elections by asking 2,000 people questions. In 1936, he proved it. In 1948, he failed spectacularly. Polling has been refining that balance ever since. Before scientific polling, newspapers and magazines conducted straw polls, massive surveys asking readers about preferences. In 1936, the Literary Digest mailed 10 million mock ballots asking voters about the Roosevelt-Landon race. They received over 2 million responses, the largest political survey in history. The Digest predicted Alfred Landon would win in a landslide, 57% to 43%. Roosevelt won in an actual landslide, 61% to 37%. The Digest went bankrupt shortly after. What went wrong? The magazine mailed surveys to people listed in telephone directories and automobile registration lists. In 1936, during the Depression, these were wealthy people who disproportionately opposed Roosevelt. The sample wasn't representative. George Gallup, a young statistician, had used different methods. He surveyed just 50,000 people, but selected them to represent the population's demographics proportionally. He correctly predicted Roosevelt's win and launched modern polling. Gallup's insight was profound. You don't need to ask everyone to know what everyone thinks. You need to ask the right people. Random sampling, properly done, provides accurate estimates with quantifiable margins of error. Polling became essential to campaigns. Candidates used polls to identify issues, target messages, and allocate resources. Journalists used polls to report on races. Polling data drove coverage, creating self-fulfilling prophecies. Candidates leading in polls received more attention, which helped them maintain leads. But polling faced challenges. In 1948, every major pollster predicted Thomas Dewey would defeat Harry Truman. Gallup, Roper, and Crossley all got it wrong. They'd stopped polling too early, missing Truman's late surge. They'd assumed undecided voters would break for Dewey. They'd sampled by quota rather than randomly, introducing bias. After 1948, pollsters reformed methods. They continued polling until Election Day. They used probability sampling. They adjusted for demographics. Accuracy improved. By the 1980s, polling was sophisticated. Tracking polls monitored daily shifts. Focus groups probed emotional responses. Dial testing measured reactions to speeches and ads in real time. Campaigns became data-driven operations, optimizing every message. The 2000s brought new challenges. Cell phones replaced landlines. Caller ID allowed people to screen unknown numbers. Response rates plummeted, from 36% in 1997 to 9% in 2012. Getting truly random samples became nearly impossible. Online polling emerged, but internet users weren't representative of all voters. Pollsters adjusted with weighting, statistically correcting samples to match population demographics. This introduced subjectivity. Different weighting choices produced different results. 2016 exposed polling's fragility. State polls in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania missed Trump's support among non-college whites. National polls were roughly accurate. They predicted Clinton would win the popular vote, which she did, but state-level polling failed where it mattered most. Pollsters debated what went wrong. Were respondents lying about supporting Trump? Were likely voter models incorrect? Had education become a crucial demographic variable they'd ignored? Did late deciders break overwhelmingly for Trump after James Comey's October letter? 2020 polls also showed errors, though smaller. Biden's lead was somewhat overstated. Polls suggested a comfortable victory. The actual margin was narrower. Pollsters admitted they still couldn't fully account for Trump supporters' behavior. Modern polling faces existential challenges. Response rates below 5% call into question whether samples are meaningful. Weighting adjustments are increasingly aggressive, introducing potential bias. Herding, pollsters adjusting results to match others rather than reporting what their data shows, distorts accuracy. Yet polling remains essential. Campaigns spend millions on private polls. Media organizations commission surveys constantly. Prediction markets and forecasting models analyze polls to estimate election probabilities. The science of guessing has become sophisticated but not perfected. Polling can identify broad trends but struggles with close races. It captures snapshots of shifting opinions. It provides information but not certainty. Gallup proved in 1936 that asking 2,000 people could predict how millions would vote, but 2,000 people must be the right people, ask the right questions, at the right time, or the prediction becomes literary digest-style disaster. Democracy deserves good data. Polling, despite imperfections, provides it. The alternative, guessing blindly, is worse. What democracy dreams about when it sleeps, every 4 years, Americans perform a miracle. They argue, count, and concede without civil war. This is not normal. For most of human history, power transferred through violence, inheritance, or both. In 1796, John Adams defeated Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson accepted defeat. In 1800, Jefferson defeated Adams, and Adams left Washington at dawn rather than attend the inauguration. He was angry, bitter, wounded, but he left. Power transferred peacefully. That was revolutionary. In most nations, losers didn't concede, they fought. But America, imperfect and compromised and built on the backs of enslaved people, nonetheless established something remarkable. The idea that elections decide leadership and everyone, winners and losers, abides by the results. This book has traced 25 elections across 2 centuries. Each was different, some polite, some vicious, some boring, some transformative, some decided by ideas, others by image or accident. But everyone ended the same way. Someone won, someone lost, and the Republic continued. Not always smoothly. 1824 produced the corrupt bargain. 1876 traded the presidency for the end of Reconstruction. 2000 required Supreme Court intervention. 2020 sparked violence at the Capitol. Democracy is messy. The founders designed it that way. They feared both mob rule and tyranny, so they built a system of competing powers, overlapping authorities, and complicated processes. The Electoral College is the purest expression of that philosophy. Indirect, mathematical, confusing, and occasionally producing outcomes nobody wanted. But it works, most of the time. The elections in this book reveal patterns. Image matters as much as substance. Television changed everything. Money corrupts but doesn't determine outcomes. Voters punish incumbent parties during crises. Campaigns adapt to technology. Polling is inexact. Third parties can reshape races without winning them. But the deepest pattern is this: American democracy endures because losers concede. Not happily, Adams fled at dawn. Clinton never got over 2000. Trump never conceded at all. But eventually, usually, power transfers. Every presidential election is an experiment in collective decision making. 150 million people with different interests, values, and information somehow choose a single leader. The process is imperfect. Some votes count more than others. Money buys influence. Misinformation spreads. Structural barriers exclude voices. Yet every few years, Americans line up to argue peacefully. They debate in living rooms, on social media, at kitchen tables. They volunteer for campaigns, donate money, make phone calls. They stand in lines, sometimes for hours, to cast ballots that might not even matter, depending on which state they live in. Why? Why participate in a system designed by 18th century slaveholders, modified through amendments and court decisions, operating through mechanisms most voters don't understand? Because it's better than the alternative. Democracy isn't ruled by the majority, it's ruled by legitimacy. Whoever wins must be accepted as legitimate by those who lost. That requires trust in the process itself. When trust breaks down, as it did in 1860, as it nearly did in 2020, the entire system threatens to collapse. The elections chronicled here built and tested that trust repeatedly. 1828's mudslinging proved campaigns could be ugly and democracy would survive. 1912 proved personality could fracture parties. 1960 proved television mattered. 2008 proved the internet was reshaping politics. 2016 proved algorithms and echo chambers created new vulnerabilities. Each election was, in its way, a crisis. Each one passed. What does democracy dream about when it sleeps? It dreams of peaceful transitions, of voters accepting outcomes, of losers promising to try again in 4 years. It dreams of arguments resolved without violence, of legitimacy maintained through consent. It dreams of the next election, because there's always a next election. That promise sustains democracy through its worst moments. If you lose today, you can win tomorrow. If your candidate fails, another will rise. The game continues. The conversation never ends. 248 years after independence, American democracy remains an ongoing experiment. It has survived civil war, depression, world wars, assassinations, scandals, and insurrections. It has expanded from propertied white men to all citizens. It has evolved from whispered conventions to social media campaigns. It will face new challenges: artificial intelligence, deep fakes, climate migration, and technologies we can't yet imagine. Future elections will look different from past ones. But if democracy dreams, it dreams of what every election in this book demonstrated: that power belongs to the people, that votes matter more than violence, and that every few years, Americans renew their commitment to solving problems through ballots instead of bullets. The miracle isn't that democracy works perfectly. The miracle is that it works at all. Every 4 years, Americans gather at polling places, at watch parties, at protests and celebrations, and they dream that dream together. Then they wake up and argue about what happens next. That's democracy. Imperfect, frustrating, inspiring, exhausting, and worth defending. The next election is coming. The dream continues. And that brings us to the present. 248 years of arguments, ambitions, scandals, and surprises. 25 elections that prove democracy is never guaranteed, always messy, and somehow still standing. So the next time you complain about campaign ads or worry about the future, just remember we survived an election decided by whether tiny pieces of paper were sufficiently detached. We survived a candidate who campaigned from his front porch and won by promising absolutely nothing would change. We survived faithless electors, corrupt bargains, hanging chads, and a former president who refused to attend his successor's inauguration because his feelings were hurt. Democracy doesn't require perfection, it just requires that we keep showing up to argue, to vote, and most importantly, to let the other side win when they do. So tonight, be grateful you're not John Adams fleeing Washington at 4 in the morning, or Richard Nixon sweating under studio lights, or Al Gore watching Florida count ballots for 36 days. Sleep well. The Republic's still here. And in a few years, we'll do this whole beautiful mess all over again.